A useless employee like you should just disappear. This company doesn't need people like you." Mark Johnson leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, smirking as if he had just handed down some divine judgment. His eyes, dark with condescension, flicked over me like I was something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Insignificant, disposable. 15 years. That's how long I had dedicated my life to this company. 15 years of grinding away, of late nights and early mornings, of fixing mistakes I didn't make and covering for incompetent men who got ahead because of connections, not competence. My name is Jane Carter. I'm a 41-year-old salaried employee. I grew up comfortably, but everything changed when my father passed away from a stroke just before I graduated high school. Losing the breadwinner left my mother and me in a tough spot. And then here I was, standing in front of a man who had barely been here 3 years, watching him dismiss my existence like I was nothing. I could feel the heat creeping up my spine, the sharp sting of injustice burning in my chest, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. My lips curled into a smile. Not warm, not submissive, just knowing. Useless people should be fired, right? For the first time, something flickered across Mark's face, uncertainty. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. His grin widened, his confidence unshaken. "Exactly, you finally get it," he laughed, sharp and arrogant, the sound bouncing off the walls of his office, a man reveling in his own self-importance. He had no idea. Tomorrow the ground beneath him would collapse. Tomorrow the man who sneered at me, who spent years tearing me down, would be on his knees. Tomorrow I would look at him the way he had always looked at me, like something small, something weak, something that never should have dared to think it mattered. But today, I let him have his illusion. I remember when I first walked into this company, nervous, eager, hungry to prove myself. I didn't have an Ivy League degree or a last name that meant something. What I had was grit. I started at the bottom, answering phones, scheduling meetings, fetching coffee. But I worked. I stayed late, volunteered for projects no one else wanted, outperformed colleagues with fancier resumes. I earned my place, or at least I thought I did. Then Mark Johnson arrived. He waltzed into this company like he owned it. Privileged, polished, backed by a family name that opened doors. He had the degree, the connections, the smirk of a man who never had to struggle for anything in his life. And from the very beginning, he made it clear I was beneath him. "You're not management material, Jane. People like you don't belong in leadership. Maybe you should stick to what you're good at, handling emails and running errands." He never said it outright, but the message was clear: you don't belong here. And no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I proved myself, it was never enough. Because men like Mark didn't respect effort, they respected power. And soon he would see exactly how much power I had. I wasn't the first. I wasn't even the worst case. Mark thrived on control, on watching people squirm under his authority. He made sure to keep people in their place, especially those he saw as threats. Michael, a single father, one of the best project managers in the company, was his first real victim. Mark buried him in impossible deadlines, micromanaged him to the point of exhaustion, humiliated him in meetings. One day, Michael just left. No goodbye, no explanations, just a resignation letter and an empty desk. I watched it happen. I watched it happen to others. Then, it was my turn. Mark started with the small things, reassigning my projects, excluding me from key meetings, making sure I was the last to hear about decisions that affected my own work. Then came the public humiliation. "Jane, you don't mind handling the coffee order, do you? I mean, it's more your skill set. Maybe next quarter we'll find you something productive to do." I gritted my teeth and endured. I thought if I worked harder, if I showed my worth, I could outlast him. Then he did something I couldn't ignore. He framed me. A fake email, supposedly sent by me, insulting one of our biggest clients. It was the perfect move, enough to stir doubt, enough to get me written up. "This is reckless," Jane, Mark had said, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. Honestly, not surprising considering your background. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not in rage, not in despair, in clarity. I had spent my entire career trying to be respected, trying to prove myself, but respect wouldn't save me. Power would. And Mark had no idea I had more power than he could ever comprehend. Mark thought he had won. He thought I was defeated. That he had backed me into a corner, stripped me of my credibility, and left me with no choice but to walk away. He had no idea that I had spent the past 6 months preparing for this very moment. I let him think I was weak, that I was just another casualty of his power plays. What he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that I owned 90% of this company, that tomorrow at the shareholders' meeting his name would be dragged into the light, that the documents were already prepared, that the board had already seen the evidence, that the security footage, the fraudulent transactions, the harassment complaints, every single piece of his corruption was already in the hands of the people who could end him. Tomorrow he would be fired in front of the entire company. Tomorrow his career would be over. Tomorrow, Mark Johnson would know exactly what it felt like to be powerless. And when that moment came, I would be right there, watching, smiling. But today I let him have his fun. 15 years, that's how long I had given to this company. I wasn't born into wealth. I didn't have a last name that carried weight or a degree stamped with an Ivy League crest. What I had was work ethic, a refusal to quit, no matter how many times I was told I wasn't enough. I started at the bottom, receptionist, the woman behind the desk answering phones, smiling politely while executives walked past without a second glance. I took the late shifts, the weekends, the projects no one wanted, not because I was desperate, but because I knew that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, I could climb. And I did. Step by step, I moved up. First to an assistant role, then into project management. I learned this company inside and out, from the way deals were closed to how the industry itself was evolving. I didn't just do my job, I mastered it. Robert Williams, our former CEO, saw that. He wasn't the type to care about where you came from or what fancy school was listed on your resume. He valued loyalty, work ethic, and people who built things instead of just inheriting them. Under his leadership, this company wasn't just a workplace, it was a community. Then Mark Johnson arrived, and everything changed. Mark didn't build anything, he bought his way in. His father was one of our largest investors, a man who had no problem pulling strings to get his unqualified son a leadership position he hadn't earned. Mark waltzed into this company with a 6-figure salary, a corner office, and an ego big enough to swallow the entire damn building. From the moment he arrived, the culture began to shift. It started small, decisions being made behind closed doors, promotions going to his friends instead of the people who deserved them. Then came the manipulation, the way he played executives against each other, the way he found weak spots and exploited them. But his real talent? Mark knew how to break people. I watched it happen over and over. First, he singled them out, a minor mistake exaggerated into incompetence, a missed deadline that wasn't their fault, a whispered rumor about underperformance, repeated just enough times for it to stick. Then he pushed extra work, less credit, public humiliation, disguised as constructive criticism. Most people cracked. Some quit, some held on long enough to be fired, their reputations conveniently destroyed before they could speak out. And then it was my turn. I was too experienced to fire outright. That was Mark's problem. I had a track record. I had earned the respect of my colleagues. He couldn't just get rid of me, not without a reason. So he made one. It started with the little things. I'd walk into meetings to find that my name had mysteriously been removed from the invite list. Projects I had been leading were reassigned without explanation. Decisions I had been involved in were suddenly being made for me, usually by someone far less competent. Then came the humiliations. Jane, you don't mind handling the coffee order, do you? I mean, it's more your skill set. Maybe next quarter we'll find you something productive to do. He would say it in front of others, a joke, a light jab, a slow, deliberate dismantling of my credibility brick by brick. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, he framed me. A fake email, supposedly sent by me, filled with insults toward one of our biggest clients. A scandal that cost the company money, trust, and nearly cost me my career. This is reckless, Jane. Mark had said, shaking his head in mock disappointment. Honestly, not surprising considering your background. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not in rage, not in despair, in clarity. I had spent my career believing that if I worked hard enough, I would be valued, that if I proved myself, I would be respected. I was wrong. Because respect doesn't win wars, power does, and Mark was about to learn just how much power I actually had. I wasn't Mark's first victim. I wasn't even the worst. Michael was. A single father, a good man, one of the best project managers in the company. He had worked just as hard as I had, longer hours, bigger accounts, a spotless record. And then Mark made him a target. It started the same way. Suddenly, Michael's name was missing from the important emails. His projects were handed off to people less qualified. His work was scrutinized under a magnifying glass, while others got away with sloppy mistakes. Then came the late nights, the impossible deadlines, the suffocating pressure. Michael was too good to be fired, too loyal to quit, so Mark broke him. He cornered him in a meeting, tore apart months of his work in front of the team, humiliated him, made him feel small. And then, just like that, Michael was gone. No dramatic exit, no goodbye, just a resignation letter and an empty desk. Mark didn't care, because to him, Michael was never a person, just an obstacle, just like I was. For a long time, I thought if I just held on, if I just endured, things would get better. But I was done enduring. Mark thought he had beaten me. He thought I was broken, that I was just another casualty in his rise to power. What he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that I had spent months preparing for this. He thought I had nothing, but I had everything. Tomorrow, at the shareholders' meeting, his name would be dragged into the light. The fraudulent transactions, the harassment complaints, the security footage of him stealing company funds. It was already in motion. By the time he realized what was happening, it would be too late. Tomorrow, Mark Johnson wouldn't just lose his job, he would lose everything. And when that moment came, I would be there, watching, smiling, because some people don't deserve a second chance. Some people deserve to burn. Mark Johnson thought he had won. He strutted through the halls like a king, surveying his kingdom, flashing his perfect, insufferable smirk at every employee he deemed beneath him, which was nearly everyone. He laughed, made jokes, acted like he was untouchable. He had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse beneath him. For months, I had played the long game, allowing him to believe he had stripped me of any power. He thought I was nothing, just another casualty, another expendable liability in his endless rise to dominance. But the truth? While he had spent the past year tearing me down, I had been building his downfall. And now, the trap was set. Mark was many things, vindictive, cruel, manipulative. But above all else, he was careless. He had gotten away with so much for so long that he believed himself invincible. He never stopped to consider that someone, anyone, might be watching. And I had been watching. For months, the financial fraud was the first crack in his armor. It started with expense reports that didn't add up. At first, they were subtle, slightly inflated costs for client dinners, first-class flights instead of economy. Things that, on their own, wouldn't raise alarms. But when I cross-checked those reports against company credit card statements, it was a mess. Thousands of dollars funneled into mysterious accounts that didn't belong to any actual vendor. Fake invoices for consulting services that were never provided. Money that simply disappeared. So I started digging deeper. I combed through archived financial records, I searched for patterns, and soon, the fraud wasn't subtle anymore. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been stolen. Mark wasn't just a corporate bully, he was a criminal. But I needed more. I needed evidence so damning that not even he could talk his way out of it. That's when I called Michael. Michael had been Mark's first real casualty. A brilliant project manager, a man who had given this company everything, and in return, he had been chewed up and spit out, his career destroyed because he had refused to play Mark's games. But he didn't leave empty-handed. When I reached out, I expected hesitation, maybe even resentment. But instead, he simply said, "Took you long enough." Michael had been waiting for this. He had proof. Emails, documents, contracts, all of it. Buried deep within old project files were records of Mark's shady deals, fake invoices submitted to the company's finance department, contracts with ghost clients, fake businesses he had set up as a front, deals that had been manipulated to funnel money straight into his personal accounts. Michael had access to internal documents that never made it to the board of directors, things that had been swept under the rug, hidden in layers of corporate bureaucracy, and in those documents, a clear, indisputable trail of embezzlement. Mark had been stealing from the company for years. And now I had the proof, but I wasn't done. I needed physical evidence, so I turned to security footage. Mark thought he was careful. He thought his late-night scheming went unnoticed, but the cameras never lied. I pulled the logs, cross-referenced timestamps with key card entries, and there it was. Video after video of him sneaking into restricted areas, accessing confidential company files, removing documents he had no business touching. Then came the emails. Oh, the emails. Mark had a habit of putting things in writing that he shouldn't. It was almost funny, the way he documented his own downfall. In one email chain, he bragged to an associate about how no one at this company has the guts to come after me. In another, he openly discussed falsifying quarterly reports to cover up the missing funds. And then there was the email about me. "Jane Carter is a liability. She's getting too comfortable. Time to make her disappear." I compiled everything, the fraud, the embezzlement, the security footage, the emails proving his intent. When I was done, the case against Mark was airtight, so I did what had to be done. I sent the entire file to the board of directors. And I sent it directly to Robert Williams. Then, I waited. Mark must have sensed something was coming, because the next morning I was summoned to HR. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. Mark was already there, sitting at the head of the table, arms crossed, grinning like a man who thought he had already won. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an internal review." I should have been shocked. I should have been afraid. But all I felt was satisfaction, because Mark had just played his last card. Mark spent the rest of the day gloating. He strutted through the office like a conquering hero, making sure everyone knew he had won. I heard him in the break room laughing with his cronies. "She thought she could take me down? Please, that woman was nothing but dead weight. A parasite. I did the company a favor." His voice was dripping with pure arrogance. He celebrated my downfall like it was the crowning achievement of his career, and I let him have his moment. Because what he didn't know, tomorrow was the shareholders' meeting, and I wasn't coming as an employee, I was coming as his executioner. I had been waiting for this moment. As I stepped into the boardroom, every eye turned toward me, some with curiosity, some with confusion, and one pair, Mark Johnson's, filled with pure disbelief. For the first time in his miserable career, he wasn't the one in control, and he knew it. Mark leaned back in his chair, that signature smirk plastered across his face. Arrogance oozed from every pore. "What the hell are you doing here?" He scoffed, his voice thick with amusement. He barely glanced at me before turning towards security, waving a dismissive hand. "Get her out of here." I didn't move. Neither did security. Because Mark Johnson was no longer calling the shots. The air was thick with tension. Then a slow, measured voice sliced through it. Robert Williams, the man who had built this company from the ground up, the man Mark had been desperately trying to push into retirement. He sat at the head of the table, hands folded, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his tone was cold. "She's not an employee." He turned toward Mark, watching the color drain from his face. "She is the controlling shareholder. She owns 90% of this company." The smirk vanished from Mark's face. His entire body stiffened. His hand, which had been resting so confidently on the table, twitched. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out, because for the first time in his life, Mark Johnson was speechless. No, that's impossible." Mark finally choked out, shaking his head. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but there was none. The room was filled with shareholders, executives, power players, the very people he had spent years manipulating, schmoozing, controlling. And they were all staring at me. I took my time. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out a file and laid it on the conference table. "I would sit down if I were you," I said smoothly. Mark's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't move, so I flipped the folder open and I began. I started with the financial records. Over the past 3 years, Mark Johnson has funneled nearly $750,000 of company funds into private accounts. I slipped the first document across the table. Bank statements, wire transfers, fake invoices, every transaction tied back to him. Murmurs rippled through the room. Mark scoffed. "This is ridiculous. I would never..." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not done." Next, I pulled out the security footage, a projector flickered to life, and there, on full display, was Mark himself, sneaking into restricted areas, accessing confidential files. Frame after frame of him stealing company property. More murmurs. Someone cursed under their breath. Mark's face turned white, his hands gripped the edge of the table. This could be anyone," he sputtered. "Blurry footage, that's your evidence? Come on," I smiled. And then I played the audio recordings. Mark's own voice filled the room. "These idiots don't even know what's happening. I could rob them blind and they'd still pat me on the back for a job well done. Michael?" Yeah, he was dead weight. I made sure he got the message. "Jane Carter, that woman is nothing. She's just another liability. I'm going to get rid of her like I did the rest." The whole conference room was silent. The kind of silence that only happens right before an explosion. Mark's face drained of all colour. The room erupted. Executives whispered furiously to each other. One of the senior shareholders slammed his fist on the table. "This is unacceptable," someone shouted. Mark stood up so fast his chair skidded back. "This is taken out of context," he shouted. "This is a smear campaign. It's all lies." Robert Williams stood, and when he did, the entire room fell silent. "Enough." His voice was low, controlled, deadly. He turned towards security. "Remove him from the building, immediately." Mark panicked. He spun toward the board, his desperation tangible. "You can't do this. I built this company." No one was listening. Security stepped forward, but Mark fought. "Wait! You don't understand. This is a mistake. Jane set me up." I simply smiled. "I didn't have to set you up, Mark." Security grabbed his arms. "You did this to yourself?" And then, the moment I had been waiting for, Mark dropped to his knees, not by choice. Security was dragging him down, forcing him into the same powerless position he had shoved so many others into before, and as they hauled him out, he looked at me, not with arrogance, not with confidence, with pure, unfiltered fear. And I looked at him the way he had always looked at me, like he was nothing. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, the room let out a collective breath, and then applause. First from one person, then another, until the entire room was clapping. I felt something in my chest loosen. Relief, victory, justice. Robert Williams turned to me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Let's discuss the future, Miss Carter." I took my seat at the table, my table, and just like that, Mark Johnson was gone. And I was just getting started. Mark Johnson was gone, dragged out of the boardroom, humiliated, stripped of his power. His reign had ended the way all tyrannies do, with a whimper, not a roar. But men like Mark, they don't go down quietly. They claw, they scratch, they flail for any last shred of control, desperate to rewrite their own downfall. And that's exactly what he tried to do. The first attack came within hours. By the time I got back to my office, my new office, the internet was already buzzing. Mark had taken to social media, spinning his own fantasy version of the events that had just unfolded. According to him, I was a power-hungry, backstabbing liar who had stolen the company out from under him. I was the real victim, he wrote. Jane Carter manipulated the board, fabricated evidence, and orchestrated a corporate coup to seize power. This is what corruption looks like. It was almost impressive, really, how quickly he had gone from ruthless executive to a pitiful, sobbing martyr. But Mark had underestimated me again, because for every fake sob story he posted, there were witnesses, employees, shareholders, clients, people who had seen his true nature, people who knew the truth, and they spoke up, publicly, loud. The more he tried to paint himself as the victim, the more the internet tore him apart. Within days, his name became synonymous with corporate fraud. No one believed him, no one pitied him. He had spent his entire career burning bridges, and now there was no one left to save him. But still, he wasn't finished, because when manipulation failed, he turned to crime. The security alarms went off at 2:37 a.m. By 2:45, police had him in cuffs. Mark had snuck into the building, or at least he had tried to. He still had his old key card, but he was too stupid to realize that I had already revoked all his access. So he tried to break in manually. For what? To steal documents? To erase evidence? To somehow undo the inevitable? It didn't matter. Because when the cops shoved him into the back of the squad car, the final chapter of his pathetic story had been written. Mark Johnson wasn't just a disgraced CEO. Now he was a criminal, and this time there was no coming back. The next morning, I walked into my office, my real office, for the first time, the CEO's office. And it was mine. The nameplate had already been changed. The desk, once a throne of arrogance under Mark, felt different under my hands. Lighter, powerful, deserved. I had earned this, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first order of business, undoing the damage Mark had done. I called a meeting, company-wide. When the employees gathered, they were expecting another cold corporate speech. What they got instead was the truth. I didn't sugarcoat it. This company lost its way under Mark Johnson. People were mistreated, careers were destroyed, the culture we once had, it was poisoned. That ends today. The room was silent. Then, I made the biggest announcement of my career. I was bringing them back. Everyone Mark had forced out, Michael, the employees who had been sabotaged, humiliated, pushed into resigning. The people who had built this company just like I had, I was rebuilding what he had tried to destroy. And when I finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. That evening, I stood at the top floor of the company I now owned. The skyline stretched before me, the city glowing beneath the night sky. For the first time in years, I breathed freely. Everything Mark had taken from me, I had taken it back, and more. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered. And as I stared down at the world below, I realized something. This wasn't just a victory. This was just the beginning. If you were Jane Carter, how would you handle Mark?